There's already pushback tonight after the Prime Minister announced an inquiry into Australia's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Anthony Albanese says it's important to learn what worked and what didn't. The year-long examination will be led by epidemiologist Professor Catherine Bennett. But there's criticism it won't look at decisions made by the states and territories, even though lockdowns and border closures sparked so much controversy. The opposition calling it a, quote, complete waste of time. Let's bring in our panellists. Author and journalist Caroline Overington, who's in Sydney, and journalist Rick Morton is joining us from Boonah in Queensland. Thanks for joining us, guys. Caroline, some of the most controversial decisions in the pandemic weren't made at the federal level. Should the scope of this inquiry be expanded?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the Australian public was subjected to the most outrageous public health experimentation that we have ever seen in the history of this country. And now we're being told that the inquiry into it is going to be half-baked. So it's not even a royal commission. So you can't even really compel anyone to give evidence. I mean, people have surely not forgotten how egregious and outrageous the insults against our fellow citizens were. I mean, have you forgotten, for example, people camped on the Victorian border, unable to return to their own homes for months on end? Have we forgotten about the plight of the people who lived alone and who were lonely in Victoria for months and months on end, and the elderly who were locked in aged care centres and aged care homes where COVID was running rampant, and people who had to die alone in hospitals and say farewell to their loved ones on iPads, and people who didn't want to have vaccines and were forced to have up to 4 of them in order to leave their house? Or if you went to like a barbecue shop, for example, and you passed somebody who had the COVID virus and the police would come and knock on your door and take you into quarantine for 2 weeks, and having to camp out at Howard Springs in the middle of the Australian desert when you were trying to return to your own country. I mean, these are the kinds of things that we desperately need an inquiry into, which must never happen again. And instead we're told we just have to put up with whatever Anthony Albanese has decided should be the terms of reference.
Rick, what do you think? I mean, the Prime Minister deflected questions about whether this inquiry will be able to force people like premiers to appear. Is this toothless? Does it have any weight behind it? Is it a complete waste of time?
Yeah, look, I honestly think if you're not going to do it the whole hog, then you are wasting everyone's time. You need to be able to compel responses. I've just finished covering the Robodebt Royal Commission. And the only reason we got even close to answers in that commission was because they had the powers of compulsion that a Royal Commission has. I think we just got half the inquiry from Caroline, so we probably don't need to go too much further. But I do think that cutting out little bits and pieces and saying you can't interrogate this, you can't interrogate that, is not what transparency is about. And I think it's a big miss on this front.
What do you think about the idea that the states and the territories aren't going to be involved and this is just going to be on a federal level?
The whole point is to prepare for the next pandemic, which one of the commissioners or panel members said will happen in our lifetime again. And so, when that virus comes back, whatever it is, it's not going to say, well, actually, don't count states and territories. They don't matter. We'll just infiltrate at the federal level. That's not how these things work. It doesn't make any rational sense at all. It seems, if I'm being honest, it seems like a political exercise, and that's not a great boon for, the very start of this inquiry.
I mean, the fact that the opposition's being so critical about it now, I mean, it's a bit rich, isn't it, given they were the ones in power when this all happened?
No, I don't think that's true at all. I mean, the people who made the worst decisions and arguably the indefensible decisions were the state premiers, Dan Andrews and Anastasia Palaszczuk in Queensland. They were responsible for the lockdowns and for the border closures that kept Australians apart from each other when they desperately needed to be together, which enforced a kind of military rule.
That's one side of it. That's one side of it.
But that's what we're supposed to interrogate, right? All sides of it. And that is one side of it. That is one side of it. The idea that Victorians were locked in their homes for 23 hours a day for months on end and able to walk in 5-kilometre circles around their own house and not see their loved ones, not hold their loved ones, people who had to die alone and not receive the medical treatment that they needed because they wouldn't be able to go into the hospitals for things like basic cancer tests and all the IVF treatments that were cancelled. We can't have forgotten this, and these were decisions that were made by state premiers.
I completely agree with you on that front, but the whole point of this, there were delays in ordering the vaccines in the first instance. I was in lockdown in one of the harsher ones in Sydney, in a hotspot, because we're in the Delta wave. The vaccines weren't arriving fast enough. We couldn't get them into arms fast enough. All of these things were problems. And yes, there were massive waiting lists at hospitals because of cancelled elective surgeries. People got sick. people got ill, and people suffered in the lockdown. But it's also true that if you don't have those preventative measures up front, then a lot of those issues like IVF cancellations and other conditions, elective surgery wait lists, they would have been worse.
Obviously, there's a lot to go through in that inquiry, and hopefully we'll learn some of those and get some answers. Let's move on. Josh Frydenberg is putting a political comeback on hold. The former Treasurer has been appointed chairman of investment banking giant Goldman Sachs. He lost his seat of Kooyong to Teal independent Monique Ryan last year, but was widely tipped to make another run for Parliament. Rick, he was once considered a future Prime Minister to lead the Liberal Party. Do you think this is the last we'll see of Frydenberg in the political arena?
I never saw it. Like, he's a nice guy and he's clearly very smart in certain respects. But, I worked in Parliament House for a little bit. He was just so needy. Like, he used to have these WhatsApp group chats where he would send his op-eds and his tweets around to certain journalists and be like, did you see my tweet? And I just don't think that's the vibe you want from someone who's considered to be a leader. There just wasn't quite the backbone there. That was shown in the fact that he refused to stand up to Scott Morrison towards the end there and paid the ultimate price for it. He lost his seat to the Teals. Having said that, I don't think he's the type of person to give up on that idea. So it might not be this time around, but he's still relatively young. Let's see what the future holds.
Exactly. Caroline, we have spoken about the ethics of the Reserve Bank governor going into the private sector. It's not new for politicians stepping into these corporate roles after a career in politics. But do you think we're losing top talent from public service?
Well, yes and no. I mean, he is the former Australian Treasurer, the Treasurer of the federal government, and so, of course, he has skills that somebody like Goldman Sachs or Macquarie or one of the big banks might want. And also, he probably does need to make a bit of money as well, because politicians, although everybody says they're particularly well paid, they're nowhere near as well paid as you will be as chairman of Goldman Sachs. I think the bigger issue for him is timing is everything in politics, and he was unlucky to lose his seat, I think, to Monique Ryan and the Teal wave. There was a massive backlash against his leader, Scott Morrison, and he got caught up in that. Had he retained his seat, he probably would have been elected leader of the opposition instead of Peter Dutton. Now Albanese has lost some skin in the Voice referendum and various other political skirmishes, so he might be sort of 3 or 4 years away from becoming a Prime Minister and the first Jewish Prime Minister of Australia. So I think there would be a bit of regret in his decision today. I'm not sure that I agree with Rick that he was too needy. He's just ambitious, Rick.
So needy. Yeah, but like even compared to other politicians, there was something about it. It was almost very schoolyard.
Some good insight there. Okay. Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews has announced plans for a statewide short-stay tax from 2025. Visitors to Victoria will pay a 7.5% tax when using Airbnb, stays or other similar sites. It's estimated the $70 million per year from the tax will go to public and social housing. Caroline, investors who own rental properties have hit out over these changes. Do you think this will actually help the housing crisis?
No, I don't think that the money will go into social housing, but then I'm cynical. I've been around a long time. Not very many governments build social housing, and social housing isn't always a great success. I think the problem of Airbnb and stays and some of those short-term providers is a really interesting one, because I know that cities like New York and Venice in Italy, for example, and Barcelona in Spain really struggle because they're such popular destinations for tourists. If you can rent out your place for $200 a night as opposed to, say, $300 or $400 a week, why wouldn't you? In which case, there isn't a lot of accommodation for locals who, after all, made those cities what they are.
Regional mayors in Victoria say they've been shortchanged. Rick, could this, do you think, hurt the state's smaller tourist towns?
I mostly agree with Carolyn on this one. I don't know that it's mostly revenue raising. I think most people who were staying at Airbnbs are still going to pay to stay at the Airbnbs plus the 7.5% levy. It might affect low-income families who are holidaying locally who can't afford to go overseas because of Qantas and other airline carriers. So, it's tough. And once you've got this business growing in these regional areas, then yes, you will suffer some of the consequences of that. But having said that, I know, living in a small country town myself now, that the rental crisis is really biting, and taking any one of those homes off the market because some individual can earn more on Airbnb is hurting a lot of local people who really can't afford to live in the cities anymore.
So you both see this as revenue raising. Do you think then that it doesn't go far enough? There should be a cap on how many days a year that people can rent out their house on Airbnb?
I definitely think so. What do you think, Rick?
I think it's all nice to have a separate tax to raise money for housing, but the real issue here is the constraint on supply, and this will not do anything about that at all.
And the rental crisis is real. I know somebody who is a friend of mine who put an ad up on flatmates.com, one of those sites where you advertise for a flatmate, and got 98 responses in the first day.
Debate in Queensland. Hospitality venues are being urged to end their no tattoo policies following a wave of complaints. Earlier this year, Mortal Kombat 2 actor Martin Ford was turned away from a Gold Coast club, and just last month a Burleigh Heads mother of two was kicked out for having a tattoo on the back of her neck. Caroline, is this kind of rule outdated?
Well, it's about bikies, isn't it? Isn't the idea that it's illegal in Queensland to be a member of an outlaw motorcycle gang? And I think the tattoos are meant to signify what gang you are a part of. And so rather than get into a fight with a bikie about whether he was or wasn't a member of an outlaw motorcycle gang, they just banned everybody with tattoos. But tattoos have become so commonplace. I think I read somewhere that something like 1 in 4 Australians now has one. Myself, I'm untouched by the tattooist's gun. I don't know about Rick. I don't know.
Rick?
I keep my secrets. I've been kicked out of many places or not let into many places in my 20s on the Gold Coast, but not because I had a tattoo, probably because I was being annoying.
But do you agree? I mean, 1 in 4 Australians now apparently have tattoos. Do you think this is a bit silly? You can't really judge someone by their tattoos.
When, literally back in the days of, the 70s and 80s when the ink was green and it's starting to fade and it pretty much typified someone who lived at the edge. Those days are over. Everyone's got a tat. I want one. I love them. I just really hate needles.
What will you get? What will you get?
Do you know what? Honestly, I'd probably get a little Prince tattoo. Sense the children's book, the adults book written by the French author.
So I thought you might get a dinosaur because I know you're absolutely obsessed with dinosaurs. You could get like a little Tyrannosaurus or a little.
Time I get a tattoo when my skin is saggy and I won't need the dinosaur reference anymore, so I can just try and keep myself young other ways. Yeah.
Okay, good stuff. Well, thank you so much, Rick and Caroline, for joining us tonight.
So great to see you.